Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Propagandacast, State of the Balance with me, your host, Imperial Dane, Master of Propaganda, Heroes Reich, and Lord of Analysis, here to sort of give you my insight as to how the state of the balance is currently, over the preceding last month. Of course, we had the huge, change to veteran since apparently hadn't quite been working properly. According to Reich, in fact, not since release, which is pretty bold of them to actually just straight up admit, which rather makes it more believable in some sense. But again, also works. Again, offensive veteran specifically was the issue. There's definitely been a shake-up there in terms of balance a bit there as well. Though mostly for the better, I haven't really got any issues there to serve. But looking at things, overall, balance roughly is healthy. There are some issues here and there with some of the armies, but overall, it's looking reasonably well. I'm seeing a variety of strategies actually being executed now by each army, which is usually a good sign. That is, you can go for several things. You don't have to just go spam infantry or spam support weapons and so on there. So, again, that's good. That's not to say there aren't some issues, some things that could be improved upon, some abilities that could do with some tweaking and so on. When we look at the Americans, still, it's very much slanted towards, just going all captain. It's very straightforward and again very good and so on there. Not a lot of players go for the lieutenant of armies, perhaps suspecting the captain and overall tagging for it might need to be made a bit more expensive. Really, it's a bit much of a no-brainer. You're getting an anti-tank unit pretty much countering most German light vehicles, or at least keeping them at bay. Follow up with a Stewart, anti-tank guns. It's a bit, I'm not entirely sure how to put it. If you're sort of trying to offset it, making the Stewart then a bit cheaper in some ways, but still I think, there might be room there for some tweaking, just to sort of make things work a bit better, if you will. I feel it's a bit off there. Overall, the Americans just feel fine. We're seeing more use BARs, more use bazookas. Doctrinally, it's a lot of armor, heavy cavalry. Not a lot of airborne, though. The Pathfinders are pretty decent, paratroopers are good, but at the same time, I think the payoff in the terms of the airborne airstrike there perhaps is where sort of the real issue lies. It's a really expensive ability that currently is actually pretty terrible. It barely hits and it doesn't really do a lot there. So essentially, I think Relic needs to tweak it. Either need to make it really, really cheap, because, that's really what the ability is currently worth, maybe even less than half the price of what it currently is, or they need to make it better somehow, because currently you're going in airstrike, the rockets are going to fly all over the place, except not on the tank you're trying to sort of knock out there. Which rather limits it. And it's not like, German anti-aircraft guns don't work at all. So I don't really see much of an excuse there for not buffing it, to be honest. One way or the other, I do think the American airstrike call in there needs to be buffed. It's just not cool. And I think similarly, heavy cavalry's airstrike could perhaps do with some tweaking as well. Either make it cheaper or just a bit better. Just some thoughts there, or you could just also make an interstate, more of a call around there, flying around, do some damage. That could also work. Would also make anti-aircraft guns a bit more effective versus that one. Just a thought anyways there, but beyond that, it's not really so much to point out with the Americans. I think they're sort of overall in a good spot. Have plenty of opportunity to attack and so on there. Mechanized perhaps could do with some slightly different abilities here, perhaps giving the airstrike instead of that reconnaissance calling. I do feel that's a bit of a weird one that doesn't quite fit in there. But beyond that, I do think, overall, when I'm playing with the Americans, beating up Germans, they're overall feeling pretty good positions, unless I really play badly, I'm going to be in trouble actually, so I just don't feel there's so much of an issue there with the Americans per se versus the Germans, as long as you play the Americans properly, which is good. And again, in terms of strategy and tactics, you see some go for a lot of resistance, some for not so much, some go armor, and some again go for other startups there. There's overall I feel a nice bit there. For the British, overall they're also in a pretty good position. Strategically, they tend to be a lot more, either go for armored cars or go for emplacements. Not so much in between, and even then they usually only go for one armored car, so that gives you, some will go for more though, depending on how quickly you can knock out the armored car. Anvil tactics we don't see so much of. Perhaps it's because it got a bit overnerfed, but part of me also thinks, just sort of fallen off the radar there. I don't think it's particularly because it's bad, just more like, the calling of the 25-pounder guns, which against the worst of the airburst sort of meant to go in. Perhaps is a bit lacking, rather undercutting that, so I mean, looking into the 25-pounder call-in could perhaps be an idea there for Relic. But beyond that, at the moment I think they're a bit low if they'd sort of really treat more and touch more with the Brits, because I think they are in a pretty strong spot. I think Company 2 charts would agree with me. They're roughly one of the best in terms of the win rates alongside the Americans in 1 versus 1. So, I mean, I think giving them too much there could be a problem. But, making things you just don't see so much use is a bit more useful. It's not bad either in that sense, Anvil could perhaps see some tweaks again. And mostly I think just making the artillery call-ins more workful so the airburst also works better. Then we'll probably also see more Churchills and so on. So that, I think, rather covers that department, if you will. Not too much else, I think, to comment on in terms of doctoral usage. It's a bit sort of, thin, but that, I think, is mostly because most British players just don't need to and can get away with it. Again, we'll say, I think, British doctrines are overall pretty strong, and a lot of flexibility built into them. I just think it's a shame most British players don't utilise them. I think if any British player were to strongly begin using them, they'd be doing even better, actually. So I don't think there's much else there. Then we have the Soviets. Alright, but I do think there's one spot that's really getting out of hand, and that's maximum spam. I mean, maximum spam is becoming very prevalent at the moment. It's very tough, again. You can just sort of roll them up, suppress, move about, again, deal with the flanker, and so on there. They're swift, mobile, suppress, do plenty of damage, again, they're tough. And of course, that also applies to other Soviet weapon teams. They are quite tough, and that also means if you flank them, sort of, you don't quite have the effect of any other weapon team being flanked, which is you can quickly run them off, even wipe them. And I think occasionally causes some problems, so I'm not entirely sure what there, but I do think overall the Maxim needs some kind of nerf. Either it needs to be slower, less mobile, because, let's be honest, they're looking around a water-cooled machine gun. That's not hot air inside there, or helium. That's water, and water weighs a bit, to put it mildly. So I do think, just making it more sluggish would be an idea there for the Russians. Just putting that one out there, to say the least. Because right now, I mean, you can just stuff at a building. It's really difficult to deal with. Out in the open, it can be difficult to deal with. And again, then so players just spam a lot of them. It causes some problems, I think. So I mean, I think the Maxim really needs to nerf there. I mean, overall, could you just consider removing, two of the men of every sort of support weapon, perhaps giving something a bit in return. Maybe, making the field gun cheaper, the mortar cheaper. Not the Maxim though, but the other support ones perhaps a bit cheaper. Though of course that might bring other risks. But that is very much an option there to consider, though, for the Soviet weapon teams. Overall, they think the Soviets are still pretty strong. Doctrinally, they've got plenty of options. We see some go Soviet Reserve Army, some go Shock, some go Guards Motor, some go Lend-Lease. I mean, in that sense, there's plenty of sort of fluidity again in terms of starting strategy. Again, we've got more penal troops appearing now. They're not a lot, but, once the veterans have worked again, more people are gravitating towards them. Snipers, scout cars, which certainly also gives problems to the Germans. So again, overall, I think they are nice, but again, I do think Maxims need to be toned down, one way or the other. Then looking at the Germans, we have the Oberkommando West. They got a pretty decent win rate as well, roughly around, I think, the same as the Americans or the British. Overall, they are also larger. I think the flak half-track, though, is a bit weird and could do with something. I mean, it's expensive, costs almost the same as it looks, but performance-wise and impact-wise, it's a lot easier to deal with, and it doesn't quite have the same impact at all. So I do think that could do with a bit of looking into some kind of small buff or price reduction, though I think a price reduction might be the wiser choice there, though not too much either. And also, while we're talking flak, the flak emplacement for Luftwaffe and fortifications is terrible. That one needs to be buffed as well. Needs more crew members, and it needs some buff to actual damage, because currently it's just not worth the resource investment whatsoever. It's pretty much a joke, so that's no good either. I mean, the Oberkommandos, of course, flow a lot on their mobility and aggression and so on, and though to a certain extent they can be hard countered by, say, a Russian scout car early on. But again, in terms of strategy, I mean, it's very much just Fult's going to do spam. You don't see a lot of Sturm Pioneers still. I do think in terms of veterans here, they're still a bit, wonky. I mean, the veterancy bonus is still applied, but still, it takes the Sturm Pioneers at least, 14 to 15 minutes to even, hit veterancy free, which is where most, other armies would have plenty of veterancy free units, well, perhaps not all, but still, it can take some time. Then again, considering how expensive they are, I don't know. It might be, of course, one of the things that off-puts, but again, I think it's all to do with just lots of Fult's going to do with Panzerschrecks. It's pretty easy. So, I mean, I still think they should just remove the Panzerschreck from the Fult's going to do, remove the Kednev, and then create a Panzerjäger unit make the Raketenwerfer doctrinal unit for call-ins and so on there, maybe fit it into the Luftwaffe ground forces, since Raketenwerfer probably utilize more by Fallschirmjägers than anything else. But really just create a Panzerjäger unit, one Panzerschreck, access to Panzerfaust, Tellermans on there as it gains veterancy, and then finally a second Panzerschreck, like, or at least around veterancy 3 that way. You can get a bunch of them, but you can't just easily spam a lot of Panzerschrecks. So I think that will be a better choice there for the Oberkommando West and will lead to something a bit more sensible. And there's also a few other things this will be. I still think, they need to add the machine gun to the Jagdpanzer 4. I just feel like there's no excuse there. And then there's also the Panther, which is just sort of a weird case also for the Wehrmacht. I'll get into that a bit later. But still, so I know the Oberkommando West still feels in a bit of a strange place. I'm not entirely sure how to put it. I mean, it's not like they're bad, it's just I do feel strategically they're a bit more limited than some of the other armies. There's something there that's lacking, and a part of me thinks it's almost a specific unit. They need something, like the 250 half-track or the 251 unit. They need something mobile, swift, aggressive from about there to help them be a bit more, aggressive, a bit more durable. And again, I still think they need to remove the fault reinforcement then from the battle group headquarters, since that's just, again, leads to some very strange gameplay for the Oberkommando West. Finally, we have the Wehrmacht, still struggles there in the early game. If you sort of play well, you can easily pin them down and sort of do a lot of nasty damage, and certainly very much required to sort of play more focused. So again, not all bad, but certainly also create some issues there for the Wehrmacht if you're not careful. And again, overall, tier 1 it's largely alright. We're seeing more Grenadier spam now, but still, not a lot more MG42s, which is a bit the interesting one. You'd figure still somehow there'd be more MG42s, but they're still not quite worth it, I suppose, in one part. Suspect there might be a small buff needed for the MD42 somewhere, somehow, perhaps an ability that allows it to create a bit of heavy cover in front of it to just dig in a bit. Perhaps that would make it a bit more useful, just something a bit extra I think for the MD42, not necessarily a stat buff, just something extra elsewhere that just somehow gives it a bit of an extra edge there, because currently it's still very risky to just go for a lot of MD42s as the Wehrmacht, and particularly hand them over to the enemies, but still I'm not so sure about that one, but I just think it's an option to at least consider there if you're a relic, though of course I don't know if they watch these very much. Otherwise, Wehrmacht tier 1 is looking pretty decent. Grenadiers again, more potent now the veterancy properly applies. G43 for example are quite good now, and I certainly go personally for a lot of G43s if I can. Overall the Wehrmacht benefited quite a bit there, since now again means they have their smaller squads, but again, now veterancy applies properly to them, so again they do pack a lot more punch, again in particular veterancy above their weight, which is rather how they are supposed to. So that's something. Panzer Grenadiers, Stormtroopers all work a lot better now, and that's good, that's lovely. That's not to say all is good. 222, there was a small surge of 222s ban, but it never seems to have caught on. Most people still go with 1 222, though I think 2 222s is a pretty solid thing for the larger part, and overall seen players do quite well with them, so not all bad there. But there's one unit I do think still is in an awkward position, has been for ages, the 251 half-track. It's just, it lacks something. It's a tier 2 unit, and if you sort of consider the other tier 2 unit, there's this one, which costs a bit more manpower, but still roughly the same. It's a lot more potent for almost the exact same price. The 251 barely has any armor in comparison. The upgrade doesn't quite, pack as much punch despite costing the same. A half-track that can shoot down aircraft, murder infantry on retreat, deal with light vehicles, flame for a half-track that doesn't quite have the same impact. It does get a bit awkward there when you sort of compare the two. And I'm not saying they should be equal, but just, something's not adding up. In particular, when you also can shoot out the M5, you can't out the 251. And again, I do think, the 251 needs more armor, because really it's just, people can actually shoot it to, bits, which just feels wrong. But secondly, it needs something. Again, the Germans were supposed to be the whole mechanized thing there. They were the ones that got infantry and mechanized cooperation together first. You just don't really see that with a 251 half-ton. Again, a part of me thinks there needs to be something there, some ability that perhaps, makes it work there. Again, a bit like the Americans' combined arms ability, just not quite as potent in all those senses, but still something there I feel would do quite well for the Wehrmacht. Again, make the 251 half-track, more useful, because currently it's actually quite a risky investment, because by the time you get a 251 out, your opponent will usually have a light tank or something that can quickly deal with it, which rather undercuts it as well there. So again, I do feel the 251 lacks something there. Again, that's sort of one of the stranger bugbears for the Wehrmacht. And then finally, there's another unit there or another bit there, which again I think where the Wehrmacht sort of struggles a bit, and that's Tier 4. I've seen so many players go for Tier 4, and I've seen so many players fail with Tier 4. I mean, going for a Panther, Sturmpanzer, just ends up in defeat because it's such a massive investment of resources. It just ends up hurting the Wehrmacht quite a bit there, and ends up just allowing the opponent to just beat them because it's just a massive resource investment that just allows them to hit your head in tanks and other things. And in that regard, that's also a bit where the Oberkommando West Panther comes in. I do think something is needed there. Overall, I think the Panther needs to be sort of looked at and sort of redesigned because, again, sure, it's got plenty of armor. Sure, it's got, high penetration. It just doesn't matter. It's being hit by like 2 or 3 T-34s or Shermans or anti-tank and so on. They just lacks impact. I mean, compared with the Common, which can just end up easily doing a lot more damage to the Panther because it can also deal with infantry and armor pretty well. And then the Panthers just saying it can't do much versus infantry, and in that sense you're just better off getting a pair of Stooks instead of a Panther, because the Stooks will A, deal better with infantry, and B, deal better with armour. And that's really where the Panther sort of, just doesn't quite fit. Again, that's also where it gets weird with the Oberkommando West, because it's just a tier with Panzer IVs, but at the same time it's also more easily accessible. So I do think, overall the Panther needs some kind of overhaul. Possibly lower its health, make it more vulnerable, but, make its gun better. Perhaps bit versus infantry or lower its rate of fire, I think just making it more useful versus infantry would be a pretty decent start. That way, make it a bit more utilitarian and make, a bit more of a choice. Of course, then of course, what do you do with the Oberkommando West? Well, one option is then to, revert some of the changes to the Panzer IV they had, the Model J, make it a bit more like the old one, thus differentiating between the Panzer IV and the Panther, and at the same time, make it a bit cheaper, thusly also again distancing themselves a bit more. That's very much an option there to consider between the two then. Or there's also the other option is where they sort of create 2 upgrades, a bit similar to how the British with Vanguard and Hammer, and then simply have one for Panzer IV, one for Panther, then add some other abilities, and then have the Yak Panzer IV just be the red-haired stepchild neither wants to touch. Perhaps unlock some specific upgrades for infantry instead then, and some bonuses that way. I mean, it would certainly be a bit more like the British, but it would help, allow the Panther and the Panzer IV, be more differentiated that way as well. And again, I think that's where, and the Sturmpanzer IV for the Wehrmacht, it just needs a buff. It's terrible. No way around that. It's just awful. It just needs to be buffed. So yeah, I think that's it. And it's not again to say the Wehrmacht doesn't have any choices, but there are, I think, things that just don't quite work up. Again, 251's barely seen uses because it's just not a good unit. Similarly, I mean, while we do see a lot of uses there of the Tier 4 units, I just don't think they're very good at all. And again, I think Panther needs some kind of rework, Sturmpanzer IV needs a buff. So yeah, that's said it. I'll probably not be one of the more popular opinions, but go figure. So I think that rather covers it here for the state of balance. A bit of a longer one, bit of a more of a rant, I suppose, in some senses. But I mean, again, some places not so much to cover, but again, with the Wehrmacht and some other bits there, I do think there's some things that need to be said, and hopefully, Relic picks up on that and does something about it, because really, Wehrmacht Tier 4, I think right now is in a pretty sad state, at least for 1 versus 1s, which I do think should count for something. So there you go. Hopefully this has been educational, hopefully this has been instructional, hopefully this has given you different matches and what to do and what not to do. If it was, subscribe, tell your friends, share it with everyone, and so on. So thank you all for joining in. I hope to see you all another time for another exciting video. This is Imperial Links, and cheers, and thank you all for watching. Bye.